Hi everyone, it's John. Welcome back to my channel. It's Wednesday afternoon, so I have another book review to share with you. This one is a bit on a backlist. I wrote a review for it quite a while ago and read it even longer ago and just never got around to talking about it. Two of my friends that I know from BookTube, Sharon, who used to have a channel of her own, and Peg, who still has a channel over at the History Shelf, and I all read this together sometime around this time in 2020. And we never got around to having our talk, so I knew that I was going to have to write the review up myself, which I wasn't looking forward to doing because it's such an expansive book. The book I want to talk about is this one, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter. You might know of Richard Hofstadter's name. He's not exactly unknown in 20th century American history writing. If you know him for anything, it's probably either this book, which, as you can see on the cover here, won a Pulitzer Prize in 1964 for nonfiction. He also wrote a really influential essay in the 50s, I think, called The Paranoid Style of American Politics. Paranoid Style in American Politics. And one of his first books, his first major book, as a professional historian, was a book-length consideration of social Darwinism, as it was deployed mostly, I think, in the 19th century. How people sort of took ideas from Darwin and applied them to social situations, which, of course, they did not exactly apply. But this one, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, is a book you see all the time on greatest books of the 20th century list, certainly greatest nonfiction books of the 20th century list. And it is just one of those books that you read and you'll have a lot of feels about it, one way or the other, love it or hate it or both. But asked to write a review is kind of an intimidating task because there's just so much meat on that bone. But what I want to do, and this sort of a heads up before I jump into this, and what I want to do for the review is sort of just talk around the topics that he's discussing in the book, and maybe sort of end up with an idea of what he's trying to get at. Richard Hofstadter spent much of his much too short life, he died when he was 54 years old, railing against the large swath of consensus opinions concerning American history. He referred to Teddy Roosevelt as a therapist of the middle class. He essentially considered Abraham Lincoln to be not much more than a conniving politician. And he cast the progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th century as a group of myopic moralists. So he has no problem making enemies, obviously. With such a cutting penchant for revisionism, it's no small wonder that Hofstadter eventually turned his scalpel to the long-standing American suspicion of anything and anyone even remotely intellectual or egg-headed. Even though he did have the heart to apologize for casting one more blow to the national self-esteem before doing so. At the heart of the book's argument is Hofstadter's assertion that a cluster of anti-intellectual attitudes overtly characterize much of American experience. And I'm not just talking about in the 20th century, I'm talking about all the way back to the founding of the country and even before. And some of these attitudes are its evangelical religion, and he's not calling all religious people anti-intellectual. He's calling a particular strain of evangelical religion, uh, saying that it has some anti-intellectual strains. Um, it's our populist politics, and when they say our, I mean the politics of the United States, the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and the ideas behind progressive education, which he will mostly associate with the likes of John Dewey. I think anyone basically familiar with the history of American Protestantism will find his indictment of evangelical religion in America as it was in the, I guess for most of its history, pretty uncontroversial, the indictment of it. I mean, he says, quote, religion was the first area for American intellectual life. And of course, he's talking about institutions like Yale and Harvard were founded to train ministers back in the 17th century. That is what they were built for. And then, as a confluence of social and cultural things happened, including our expansion towards the West, our religious institutions became less centralized around educational institutions, and they became more populist, more popular, and more much more appealing to emotion than study and scholarship. So let me begin that quote one more time. Religion was the first area for American intellectual life, and thus the first arena for anti-intellectual impulse. Anything that seriously diminished the role of rationality and learning in American religion would later diminish its role in secular culture. The feeling that ideas should above all be made to work, the disdain for doctrine and for refinement of ideas, the subordination of men of ideas to men of emotional power or manipulative skills are hardly inventions of the 20th century. They are inheritances from American Protestantism. End quote. While anti-intellectualism in American life could almost certainly be described as a book that is kind of looking to pick a fight, especially with one, sector of American political life, it has what I would call its weaknesses. As someone very, very saddened by the direction of mid-20th century education, Hofstadter seems to think that the mode of education before John Dewey's popularity was one that just solely focused on forming intellectuals and sharpening the minds of students. But there are countless complaints in the 19th century American university of it being deadly dull, of it being every bit the institution dedicated to the rote indoctrination as anything that ever would be after it. So this also leaves Hofstadter with sort of an indefensibly elitist view of education. If, as he seems to think, a post-secondary education is only befitting of someone who has intellectual gifts, where does that leave the middle, 60 or 80% of us? Some of his complaints are old hat as you read the book. Even when he wrote the book, which was nearly 60 years ago, he resents that education favors the practical and the applicable instead of the theoretical and the abstract. That it favors common sense over systematic knowledge, and that it favors heart over head. Even our exaltation of the scientific expert is entrenched in the air of sort of this technocratic expertise that is brought to the table instead of the cool objective consideration of thoughts and ideas that Hofstadter associates with the intellectual. So what Hofstadter would have made of the sort of trophy culture that we have today, in which everyone gets praise and encouragement no matter their performance, one can only guess. It seems to have been sort of an attenuation of what he already saw to be a problem back in the 60s. That is only, he would probably say, gotten worse. It would be hard to argue that this is a tight book, a tightly argued or presented book, but it would be just as hard to say that someone who was born and raised in the United States in the mid-20th century couldn't easily relate to much of the ethos and the institutional attitudes that Hofstadter is talking about here. These attitudes just sort of envelop us in American culture, and they are inescapable. If anything, Hofstadter's book gives those interested in the broad sweep of American politics a kind of a toolbox, a sociological toolbox for learning how to think about recurring patterns in American history. Everything from Jacksonian populism to the Tea Party movement, to the recent spate of conspiracy theories that have infested American political discourse, seem to make more sense when they're investigated with the sort of long historical lens that Hofstadter provides in the book. For anyone interested in a more updated version of Hofstadter's thesis, they might want to look at Susan Jacoby's 2008 book called The Age of American Unreason. I have this book and plan to review it on the channel soon, provided any more books don't get in the way first. And here's a clue to how long ago I wrote this review. I have actually since read that book and have written a review, which will be on my channel in due course in upcoming weeks. And I will say, without spoiling too much about that review, Jacoby's book, not quite the powerhouse that Hofstadter's is. But there is a lot, like I said, a lot on the bone, a lot to think about here, like it or not. If anyone's read it or has any opinions about it, I would love to hear them in the comments section. It's just one of those books that you kind of have to reckon with when you think about the history of American culture, American history, American ideas. You see it everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So, like I said, any thoughts or comments, let me know. And until then, I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.